Hello, I'm Sean Spear, editor-at-large at The Hub. Welcome to The Hub's ongoing coverage of the federal election campaign here in Canada. I'm fortunate to be joined by the founder and CEO of Abacus Data, David Coletto, to talk about some new polling he has on the state of the race and some of the bigger trends that he's witnessing in the first week of this election campaign. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Sean. Good to see you.
Yeah, indeed. David, I want to start with some exclusive polling that you've shared with us. You're going to be releasing it more broadly tomorrow morning. Why don't you just share some insight with our audience about what the latest numbers that you're finding out there in the field and what you think they mean for the race?
Yeah, so this survey was done from March 20th to 25th, and for the first time, I think going back many years, we now numerically have the Liberals ahead of the Conservatives in that horse race. The how are you going to vote today? You can see a 1 point lead for the Liberals. All intents, they're still tied, but this is continuing a trend for the Liberals that we've seen starting basically the week Justin Trudeau announced his resignation, where they're up 18 points in 2 months. The Conservatives are down 9, and look at that NDP number, down 8 to 11. So still we're not quite at some of the other pollsters showing the Liberals like 5, 6, 7 points ahead, but the trend is pretty clear. And I'm not even sure the Liberals have hit their peak yet. That momentum continues to push them 1 week after another, 2, 3 points. And it's gaining strength in the regions that they need to gain strength with. They're now ahead in Ontario. They're well ahead in Quebec. They're well ahead in Atlantic Canada. And even British Columbia, we've got the two parties statistically tied. And, in that province, back in December, the Liberals were at 12% in British Columbia. So it's a complete reversal. It's a competitive election still, but, Sean, if I had told you that the Conservatives could lose an election and still maybe get 40% of the vote, that is not what we would think of in the last decade and a half of Canadian politics. It's a remarkable consolidation that the Liberals have done in vacuuming up a lot of that, let's call it, not conservative vote out there.
Yeah, indeed. Just in parentheses, David, if I recall correctly, in 2011, when Stephen Harper won his majority government, he had something like 37 or 38% of the popular vote, and so that speaks, as you say, to the extraordinary consolidation that we've seen on the left and the center left over the past several weeks. Of course, the major factor in that development is the figure of Donald Trump and the effect that he's had on our politics. I want to bring up another visual to look at this precise point and the extent to which whether one is interpreting this race through the lens of Trump and the threat that he poses to Canada or change has a major deterministic effect on how you're thinking about the race. Do you want to just reflect on this tension between Trump versus change?
Yeah, so right now when we ask people, what's driving your vote, what's likely going to affect it, and you give them just two choices. Is it about the party that's best able to handle Trump and his decisions, or the party best able to deliver change? And right now it's 56 Trump, 44 change. That's a flip of where things were a month ago. So a month ago it was, majority were saying, I still want change. And there's still a desire for change out there. But I think this overshadow that Trump has put on everything is pushing people into a place where more and more of them are willing to say, I want change. Maybe Mark Carney represents some of that, but despite that, I'm still looking for security. And when you dig even deeper and you look at those two frames, and you then look at how those folks are going to vote, it's a remarkable correlation, right? The Liberals are ahead by almost 25 points among those who say this is about Trump, and the Conservatives lead by 30 points among those who say this is about change. And so if you're trying to understand as you watch this election, why is it that Pierre Poilievre is just obsessed in a way about making this about change, affordability, rejecting the past 10 years, it's because if that mindset is the one that people are thinking about when they go into that ballot box, they're more likely to put an X beside a Conservative candidate. And Mark Carney and Liberals want you to keep thinking about Donald Trump because the same would be true for them. And so, in this first week of the campaign, I still think that the parties are trying to frame that question. But right now, the Trump side of it has the momentum, and that seems to be the case, as this first week gets close to the end.
Yeah, a ton of insight there. To your point, I just asked the Hub team to pull up the visual that reflects what you just set out, and in particular, David, this idea that if this election is conceived of as about which party is best positioned to protect the country's interests vis-a-vis Trump, that produces a particular outcome, and if it's ultimately about change, that produces precisely the opposite outcome. And then the question, of course, is what ultimately is on the minds of Canadians as they go into the ballot box. It prompts the question in my mind, David, is there anything the Conservatives can do to make the case that they too are capable of defending Canadian interests vis-a-vis the Trump administration? In other words, if indeed the election is ultimately going to be about that first question, what, if anything, should the Conservatives be doing to try to boost themselves in the minds of Canadians on that subject?
Well, I think the first thing they probably need to do better than they have is make it clear that Pierre Poilievre is able to do that. I think he spent very effectively the last 2 years litigating the case against Justin Trudeau so well that it forced him to quit. But now they're left with, I think, an electorate that looks at Mr. Poilievre and is not quite sure he is able to handle that kind of issue. So that would be job one, is to continue to reinforce him and maybe more of the team that's around him, and give people confidence that they can take government and lead the country forward. But I think the second thing is, and this is a purely politically, not policy related thing, they've got to bring Mark Carney back down to earth. When we ask people how they feel about him, he's got a net favorable of plus 11. A modern politician in this environment to have a net favorable is very rare. There's still lots of people whose impressions of him are still, I think, very shallow. They don't know him that well, but they're projecting on him a hope that he can be the person who does that. So they've got to challenge that. They've got to challenge his motivation. And I think they're trying to. They're trying to undermine what might be his, for some, perceived experience he has, and say, well, he's not on your side. He's not actually going to defend, your interests. He's going to defend his own. And so that's the dual job they have to do. It can't just be about Carney. It's got to also be about people believing and wanting Poilievre to be the prime minister now.
This question will be a bit clumsy, so just bear with me. But it seems to me, David, that over the first week of the campaign, the Conservatives have, for all intents and purposes, leaned in to the change narrative and essentially ceded the ground on the one about Trump. We've seen a series of announcements about tax cuts and support for seniors and so on. In your judgment, is that the right strategy? Should they, in effect, go all in on trying to position this election about change where they have a clear advantage, or do they need to be hedging a bit and nodding more to the subject of Trump and his threats to the country, and the types of policy or ideas that they would put forward to satisfy those voters, that they can compete with the Liberals on that subject too?
It's a hard one, right? I think if they believe they could do it, they probably would have already done it. And I think the challenge is that it's very complicated for them. There is a subset of the Conservative base that actually is MAGA. It does like Donald Trump. And I think there is a fear that if you go too hard, I'm going to, as an observer, I think he's gone hard, but the perception that he's associated with Trump, even if he's not personally associated, that he represents something like Trump. For example, we asked people a few weeks ago, who do you think Poilievre would have voted for if he could have in the US? And a majority of Canadians think he would have voted for Donald Trump. That's the perceptual problem that Mr. Poilievre faces in an environment where the villain is Donald Trump. And he's now seen as not necessarily in cahoots with him, but at least closer to him than certainly Mark Carney or anybody else would be. And so I think they've decided, and I don't necessarily think it's the bad strategy, that if they're fighting on that playing field, they can't win this. They can't possibly do it, in part because it also means the NDP vote collapses. Because as you saw, no matter what frame we put forward, the NDP is nowhere. And they're particularly nowhere on the Trump question because Jagmeet Singh has nothing to say about that. So in essence, they need to start undermining, I think, strategically Mark Carney and allowing the New Democrats to pick away at that left side of the corporate greed, the he's not on your side frame. They got to get up 3, 4, 5 more points than they are if the Conservatives have any shot, I think, at winning government, let alone a majority. And so as much as it feels like that's what they should do, I don't know if the data backs up that kind of decision. I think they've got to at least try right now in the next 5 or 6 days to see if they can, because there is a desire for change. Like the data clearly shows that the desire for change is higher than it is today than it was at the start of the 2021 campaign. And it's equivalent to what it was at the start of the 2015 campaign. So it's there. It just needs to be expressed and somehow articulated in a way that people are focused on that and not on Trump. I'm not sure it's possible, but I think that's the outcome they need to happen if they're going to ultimately be successful.
Yeah, that's a brilliant insight there, David. A bit counterintuitive because, of course, I think there's an instinct or an impulse from a lot of observers, including conservatives, that they need to lean in on the Trump issue. And I think what I'm hearing you say is maybe not. Maybe the right strategy is to try to convince as many Canadians as possible that change is the right way to think about this election campaign. And as such, that what we've seen from them so far would accord with that. David, we love having you on at the Hub, not just because you have the numbers, but because you always have clever ways to think about the numbers, to think about the issues that are underlying them, and the ideas that we can use to navigate them. For a long time, you came to understand the core issue animating our politics as one of scarcity. In recent days, you've noted a shift from a mindset of scarcity to a mindset of precarity. Talk about what you mean and how that interacts with what we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, so, rewind back to 2023 and 2024, you had inflation at record levels that many Canadians had never experienced before, rising interest rates, healthcare capacity at a minimum, housing going through the roof, whether it's rental or market housing for ownership. And Canadians, I think, were looking around at the same time as our population was growing rapidly and feeling that the things they needed in their life were too expensive. There were too few of it. And if they had them, they would lose them and not be able to replace them. And I think, thinking about a family doctor is the perfect example. If that family doctor's on the verge of retiring and you've got to join the line of 6 million other Canadians, that's going to create a level of anxiety that pushes people down, that pyramid of needs that Maslow famously identified. And instead of thinking about, self-esteem and self-actualization and issues like social justice and even climate change became secondary to the basic needs of perceived or reality. And they're both important. There's lots of Canadians who in reality had a hard time feeding themselves. And then there was a whole subset of middle and upper middle class Canadians who believed those things were going to potentially become scarce, leads them to zero-sum thinking in this very individualist, frustrated frame of mind. Now, Donald Trump gets elected, starts threatening not just tariffs, but the existence of Canada. And at first people thought this guy's just kind of a jerk and he's joking. And the more he said it, the more it became clear that maybe he wasn't joking and this was something he wanted to do. And so precarity is about longer term uncertainty, right? It's more about, I don't think Canada might exist, or maybe I'm going to lose my job. And it builds onto other areas of concern that people have, whether it is climate change and its effects, whether it is technological change, AI disrupting their economy, their jobs, and a precarity mindset in my concept of it, and my colleague Eddie Shepard deserves credit for the term and seeing that shift in our data and pointing it to me, is that it first creates a more collective response. So instead of it's, Sean, me against you, it's us versus them, which is a version of it, but us as Canadians. Us as in we're in it together. We have a shared threat, and Trump represents that. And we released some data just today that shows we created an index of precarity. We asked people a whole bunch of questions and then scaled it up into an index. And the result is the more precarious your mindset, if you're an extreme or high level of precarity, you are far more likely today to say you're going to vote liberal. And it's correlated strongly with how you feel about Trump, how you feel about the threats to the future, not the threats to today, but the threats to the future. And I think that mindset has allowed people to get past of worrying about how do I make my life more affordable today, but actually thinking about how might it get worse in the future and who's going to protect me from that. And that subtle but important shift gives a place for a politician like Mark Carney to come along who has no political experience, but has on paper at least a resume that makes particularly baby boomers, but also many others who feel that threat and want a sense of security. And so in the place of relief, which is what I think people want in a scarcity mindset, they're looking for security. And it's a different set of leadership attributes and tone that I think is required in that kind of environment.
Yeah, brilliant answer. You've been so generous with your time. We'll have to have you back on soon to talk about, among other subjects, the age distribution of these different trends. But as we wrap up, I just want to ask one final question. If this is really a contestation between the different parties and their framing of this election between Trump and change, what should we be looking for, David, in the coming days to see which frame has won out, and how Canadians will what they ultimately will be thinking about when they go to the polls?
Well, I think I'm going to continue to track that question I showed, and if it continues to move in the direction of Trump, that's an indicator that the Liberals are in a solid place. We also asked this other question, which is kind of unconventional. We asked people, between Carney and Poilievre, who do you think's best at captaining a ship through a storm? Because a year ago, Poilievre was crushing Trudeau on things like putting out a kitchen fire or solving problems. But this is bigger than just a fire in the kitchen or putting up a shelf. This is about captaining all of us. That metaphorical ship, which we are all passengers on. I think we're looking for a captain, and that steady hand is, I think, something that's guiding a lot of people's thinking. So we're going to track that one as well. And I think if Carney's currently has like a 4 or 5 point lead on that, if it gets up to 10, I think they're going to win. And if Poilievre can close that gap, I think it's a signal he's creating some comfort and security with people that he too perhaps has the capacity to get the job done.
Great place to wrap up the conversation. If you'll permit us, David, we'd be thrilled to have you back soon to track some of those trends, as you put it. David Coletto, the chair, CEO, and founder of Abacus Data, thank you so much for joining us here at the Hub. And to our audience, we look forward to be back in touch with you tomorrow to continue to track all of the big ideas, policy, and of course, politics that are shaping the federal election campaign.
Thanks, Sean, for having me.